Good evening, Claude. Thanks very much for your time. Well, first of all, did you compare apples with apples when it comes to sort of the basket of countries that you looked at and evaluated?
Good evening. Yes, we did. The comparison or the analysis is based on extensive amount of normalized data that we have sourced from a number of respectable and well-known sources from across the world, and which effectively includes, depending on what indicator, between 160 and 200 countries, and depending on the data, from up to 1960 to now. And the indicators that we used, or that were referred to in the Bloomberg analysis, which gave rise to this interview, went back to 2006. I want to warn that because we only looked at the period 2006-2019, we only have a window which effectively tends to correspond with the end of the Mbeki presidency and the entire course of the Zuma presidency. We don't have that particular set of data for the period before, but we have actually analyzed South Africa's performance since 1980 from an economic policies performance. And there we see a slightly different picture than the one that has been referred to. But it confirms the story, which is that South Africa seems to have peaked in terms of governance performance, economic performance, and social policy consensus in about 2006.
I know this is will be an unpopular or not so popular narrative, but what are the possibilities of a Zuma presidency or era having inherited the pitfalls of the Mbeki era? Would such possibility even exist in terms of the information you've been able to scrutinize?
It's an interesting question, and I think it deserves to be looked at and analyzed. So let me just tell you what kind of data we've looked at. So first, our analysis is based on very, very solid and established international growth and development theory. You know, we look at effectively the state performance. So the paradigm is the following: that country performance really at the end of the day is state performance, the performance of the institutions of public action. And it's really based on this very powerful field of institutionalism, you know, which come against, you know, the kind of neoliberal perspective that the state is the problem and that the markets will fix everything. Now, I've seen some comments.
Do you believe in that?
No, we do not. And we've seen some comments on Twitter that, you know, kind of say, well, the Eunomix analysis seems to be playing into the kind of neoliberal perception. Not at all. In fact, our work is very much based on the developmental state concept, you know, the notion that without an effective state institutions from national security standpoint and the capacity to create social capital and the capacity to rule and a country in an effective way, and leaving, you know, the concept of democracy outside, but really governance in its broader sense, and without the capacity to create sustainable growth for all, then you don't have what you call a developmental state, a strong state, a capacious state. And what you probably have is something like a weakening, fragile states. So it's very much the precepts of what we're looking at. And so looking at that, you know, what we see is peak performance in 2006, 2007, and then a progressive decline. Now, of course, and this is where it becomes really interesting and where South Africa is a complicated polity which escapes simply, you know, simple explanations. And you know, a 400-word or 600-word article will definitely not do justice to everything that we have done and studied, or nor complex reality. But the point is this, is that it corresponds to peak performance. After that, I think two factors contribute to the decline of the South Africa's performance on all those indicators. One is obviously the economic crisis, a global economic crisis, which puts a radical and brutal halt to South Africa's growth trajectory. But unlike other emerging markets, South Africa doesn't bounce back. It slightly tracks back up to 2012, and then it goes back down, and the crisis becomes perennial. And it becomes, at that point, very much a domestic crisis. And it becomes a crisis of political project, policy performance, policy efficacy, and then we discover now, state capture and the perversion of the democratic project. Now, to what extent did the period before that, the post-apartheid period from 1994 to 2006, create the condition of that? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think Mbeki never managed to create a really solid, widely shared consensus about the policy direction that he and Mandela had.
In fact, there was a great deal of resistance, especially from the unions, for example, and in certain areas there was a great deal of pressure coming from non-governmental and civil society organizations to some of the things he both said and actually did.
Indeed. And I was thinking coming here, how do we characterize, in fact, the Mbeki presidency? And I would say it's an African nationalist presidency. And it is definitely not a neoliberal presidency. In fact, I think, and it explains both the policy choices on economic policy and social policy, as well as those, for instance, on HIV/AIDS and crime. His crime and HIV/AIDS denialism is a fear that acknowledging that there is a crime problem and that there is an HIV/AIDS problem is, in fact, risking playing in the hands of xenophobic and anti-Africans, who say, look, this is happening in Africa because of X, Y, Z. But at the same time, it also explains his policy choices. I mean, he was perfectly aware of the fact that if the economy was not restructured and opened up, the likelihood of having to go to the IMF and the World Bank for standard loan agreement and losing economic sovereignty was very high. And
in fact, there may even be possibilities there that those, or the one who then came after him, which was Jacob Zuma, perhaps there were some in his administration that were then battling to understand where they fit in, and in trying to perhaps grapple with how to improve, where there were clearly inadequacies or failures.
Indeed.
And maybe then in between there were other people who came into, who entered the space and started exploiting it for their own ends. I think this is a discussion that is no doubt we'll have to get into. I'll ask you to come back and
Thank you so very
explore
much.
this further, but we're going to leave it there for now. Thanks very much indeed for coming through. A very, very interesting study here indeed, and also how South Africa's performance on a whole range of social, economic and governance measures deteriorated more in the past 12 years than any other nation at war. No doubt the kind of conversation we should have with a lot of players and consider, in fact, in much more depth.